I'm not certain what the exact details of the deal between Charles and Mister Sinister are, but I'm fairly certain Charles will come to regret it in the end. The past 3 issues of Jonathan Hickman's Powers of 10 and House of X series have been the most action-packed, straightforward stories yet. This week's Powers of 10 number 4 dials it back and is much more in line as far as story and pacing go with the Powers of 10 number 1 and 2, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. After all the breakneck action and loss the past 3 weeks, it's time to slow things down a bit and learn new details about Charles and Erik's relationship with Mister Sinister, which is yet to be explored. Hickman also provides a new level of insight regarding the sentient island Krakoa and its inner workings. We also revisit the ascension portion of the story, which is still the most ambiguous and will probably be the last thread Hickman ties up before the 6 new X-Men titles releasing in October. Bottom line up front, this is still a very good comic book, but it's probably the weakest of the series since Powers of 10 number 1. Hickman needs to keep adding layers to his new vision for X-Men, so a step or 2 back was expected during this issue, at least by me. In order to get extremely impactful comics like Powers of 10 number 3 and House of X 3 and 4, a solid foundation needs to be laid. This comic is a bit of a breather from the last few as Hickman takes the time for world building once again. I personally appreciate most everything in this comic, although I don't think the humor is particularly effective. Still, I highly recommend Powers of 10 number 4, but only for people already reading the 2 series. If you try to jump on the Hickman X-Men hype train on this issue, you're gonna be very lost, and little if anything is gonna make sense. Before I get into the details of this week's Powers of 10 comic book, I humbly ask if this is your first time viewing the channel, or if you're a regular and haven't yet, please consider subscribing. I've also been told by a handful of friends they were recently up-subbed to Thinking Critical YouTube. If you are one of my loyal viewers, please make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. And if you enjoy my content, please let your friends know Thinking Critical YouTube is a go-to source for comic book reviews, news, discussion, and in-depth analysis. Now, it's time to dig into all the details of the latest chapter in the most exciting comic series of 2019. It's time for your Powers of 10 number 4 comic book review. R.B. Silva's art continues improving as Powers of 10 moves along. He, along with color artist Marte Gracia, do a fantastic job separating the X0, X1, and X3 stories visually. The X0 time frame has a red tone, X1 is distinguished with yellows, and X3 is highlighted by blues. There is a color shift at the end of the comic, and I'm still on the fence whether this is an actual time shift within the story. I'll explain why that could be very important towards the end of the review. We can clearly see the beings of the X3 timeline aren't the first Earthlings to assimilate with the Phalanx, as Cypher's Warlock armor clearly originated from that technology. Overall, R.B. Silva and Marte Garcia's visuals continue shining in Powers of 10. I rate the art 4 out of 5. The story opens with Charles and Erik traveling to Bar Sinister, seeking an audience with the man behind the mutant breeding pits on Mars in an alternate timeline. The atmosphere feels out of place in Hickman's X-Men. Mister Sinister and his court of clones feels like something from Alice in Wonderland rather than the Marvel Comics universe. There's a good bit of humor in this portion of the story, and it's hit or miss for me. I see this portion of the story being absolutely loved or hated by most readers. I'm personally comfortably in the middle. It serves a purpose, but also feels off in comparison to the previous 7 comics. Take this scene. Sinister admires Magneto's cape, and his servant states it's an outrage, and he always thought Sinister should have one of his own. Incensed, he calls for his execution for not saying something earlier. It's effective and amusing to a degree, but it feels like nothing in the story so far. I get Hickman's portraying just how eccentric and weird Mister Sinister and his fortress Bar Sinister are, but it comes off as a bit too silly at times. Sinister's been very busy with his genetic experiments and is compiling a comprehensive database cataloging the world's DNA. Charles suggests he concentrate his efforts on mutant genes. He even offers to provide rare samples, including his own. A new version of Sinister, himself with the mutant gene, emerges and takes the throne, agreeing to work with Charles. Charles then tells him he must begin his work, but forget why he's doing it, and that he and Erik were ever there. This is an enormously important scene. We know Mister Sinister was responsible for the mutant breeding programs that spawned cloned and hybrid mutants during the X2 and X3 timelines. The opening scene of House of X number 1 is Charles standing over a group of mutants being birthed from pods, seemingly on Krakoa. Charles made a deal with Mister Sinister 10 years prior, and we don't know the details. But we do know he provided samples of mutant DNA for Sinister to work with. Who died during House of X number 4? Were those the original versions of Cyclops, Wolverine, and Jean Grey, or were they clones? Was it a mixture of the original mutants and clones? Does Charles have a clone army of mutants the world is unaware of, waiting to be deployed? If so, where is he hiding them? If I had to guess, the Krakoan tumor seeds that hide things from the sentient island plays a part in this at some point. Also, it's important to note, he's not looking to partner with Sinister like he did with Erik. He's not sharing the information he has. He's manipulating him to do his bidding. Which makes sense. Nobody should trust Mister Sinister. Ever. But if he finds out Charles is manipulating him, he's likely to become a very dangerous adversary. This isn't quite the Faustian deal I imagined, but Charles and Erik are definitely playing with fire here. The first set of reference material in this comic is unlike anything presented before. It's 10 Sinister Secrets featuring all the best news and gossip from Bar Sinister. This is actually really fun, and it's a group of seemingly random facts, teasers, and riddles. Like Secret 2 talks about a trend-setting mutant cut down in their prime and references Krakoa. Secret 3 appears to reference Wanda Maximoff and hints that someone has access to her secrets. Secret 6 references a mutant with sinister ties, plan being foiled, but DNA samples were swapped beforehand. There are so many hints and teases in these 2 pages, they probably deserve their own video, and I very well may do that. But the most interesting is Sinister Secret number 10, which brainwashed mutant Sinister in place long before a certain bald someone knew and has been in on the game for almost as long as the game was being played. This sounds an awful lot like Sinister has an agent in the X-Men ranks before Charles and Erik ever arrived. Sinister events are indeed unfolding. The X1 portion of the story takes place months before the events of House of X. Charles flies Douglas Ramsey, aka Cypher, to the sentient island of Krakoa. When Cypher learns where he's standing, he's less than pleased to visit the island where mutants come to die. Charles explains he's telepathically communicated with Krakoa, but needs Cypher to build a deeper connection. When Douglas finally speaks with Krakoa, it's really cool. Krakoa was originally a part of Okara. The Twilight Sword pierced the earth, separating Okara into separate entities, Arakko and Krakoa. The chasm between the sentient islands spawned a wicked enemy into the world. Apocalypse, the first mutant, pushed Arakko back into the chasm and sealed it, giving rise to his 4 horsemen. Krakoa remains half and not whole forever. This is very interesting. There's another sentient land, presumably underground in the same place that spawned their enemy. Will this play into this particular story? I'm not really sure, but it definitely has a world of potential for future story arcs, which is somewhat hinted at in the Krakoa reference material and a passage from the X3 timeline. Cypher built a Krakoan interface that allows other mutants to interact with the island. Sage is responsible for transit monitoring, Black Tom Cassidy runs the defense and observation, Trinary mans secondary and external systems, and Beast is responsible for Overwatch and data analysis. The most interesting information is the note at the bottom. While there has been no actual evidence of Krakoan skunkworks existing, there are rumors of a massive subterranean laboratory where Forge, the mutant not the space station, is busy building biological machines that could possibly be used to manage a mutant expansion on the island. Might they accidentally run into the other half of Okara, Arakko? It's an intriguing possibility, but there's a passage in the X3 timeline that appears to reference a future Krakoan expansion. After the possible ascension of the remaining inhabitants of Earth, they ask the Phalanx a question only they know the answer to. The response sounds like it references the expansion of Krakoa. There was a city on the mountain, and behind it the sun shone brightly, and then too brightly as it expanded to consume the city, the mountain, the world. Did Charles and his mutants try to expand Krakoa and lose control as it consumed the world? Or does this possibly reference Araco, the half that is sealed and they have no control over? And what timeline is this exactly? It originally appeared the events in X3 are during Moira's ninth life due to the presence of Silva's decaying body in the library. But the color palette shifts from the blue hues back to the yellows associated with the X1 story in this comic. Are the events in the X3 timeline from multiple lifetimes of Moira X? The miniature version of Nimrod is still here. It's possible, no matter what happens with Charles and Erik's plan to stop the man-created machine evolution, Nimrod is inevitable and the future inhabitants of Earth always attempt to ascend and assimilate with the Phalanx. This continues to be the most confusing part of the Powers of 10 story for me. Issue 4 is exposition heavy after the past 3 straightforward action-based stories. There is a ton of information to take in and digest here. There aren't many standout character moments other than the Mister Sinister introduction. The Krakoa origin is really cool and well executed. I rate the characterization 4.5 out of 5. Most of this comic is set up for future events, and there isn't much payoff in this story. I rate the plot 4 out of 5. Before I wrap this comic review up, I want to let you know about a new channel program, Outside the Bleed. If you can't get enough of House of X and Powers of 10, be sure to watch tomorrow's edition of Outside the Bleed with my good friend Skip and Tosh and yours truly. We will give our final thoughts on the big reveals in Powers of 10 number 4, as well as theorize what it all means and where we believe the story is heading. We leave the margins of the comic book and explore all the implications Powers of 10 number 4 has on the X-Men, as well as the Marvel Comics universe. I hope you all return for tomorrow's episode 2 of Outside the Bleed. The latest issue of Powers of 10 is sure to leave many, like myself, scratching their heads a bit. There's so much information presented in this comic that it honestly feels a bit overwhelming when you put it down. The art from R.B. Silva continues improving with each and every issue. Marte Gracia's color work remains excellent and visually ties House and Powers together seamlessly. There hasn't been a bad issue during Jonathan Hickman's X-Men run so far, but this is probably the weakest issue since Powers of 10 number 1. And it's still a really good comic book. Hickman is laying the groundwork for amazing moments in the future, but I'm still having a hard time wrapping my head around the significance of the X3 story, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I rate Powers of 10 number 4, 4 out of 5 overall. I highly recommend this comic to readers of the series. This is not a jumping on point for new readers. You need to read the issues leading up to this to enjoy it fully. Jonathan Hickman's House of X Powers of 10 series continues as the most exciting, best executed in the industry. This issue may leave some a bit disappointed, but there's a tremendous amount of groundwork laid for future X-Men stories. I'm not certain what the exact details of the deal between Charles and Mister Sinister are, but I'm fairly certain Charles will come to regret it in the end. I'm going to try and get Doc on the channel for a special live discussion about the Sinister Secrets and what he thinks they all mean on Sunday. If you're interested in hearing his thoughts on every secret, hit him up on social media on Twitter @ScienceJesus and let him know he needs to join me right here on the channel for a special Sinister Secrets jam session. Thank you all so much for joining me, and I hope you tune in for tomorrow's episode of Outside the Bleed featuring Powers of 10 number 4. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. I would appreciate it very much. It helps us attract more views for the channel. Subscribe for future commentary, comic book news, and reviews. And don't forget to ring the bell for notifications. If you want to talk comics, movies, and much, much more, you can follow me on Twitter @Wes_from_TC. With that, Salamat Po, and I'm out.